Tonight, we're going to follow 4 astronauts on a journey that will challenge everything you thought you understood about modern spaceflight. They're headed to the moon right now, closer than any human in over half a century. And they're going to fly right past it. No landing, no footprints, no flag. Because the truth about why we can't land on the moon in 2026 is stranger and more complicated than you might imagine. By the end of tonight, you're going to understand why returning to the moon has become harder now than it was in 1969, and what that says about how we explore space in the modern age. Before we get started, if you love exploring the depths of space as much as we do, take a second to like the video or subscribe. It's a simple action, but it helps this channel reach more curious minds like yours. Now, let's begin. Right now, as you're watching this, 4 human beings are farther from Earth than anyone has been in 54 years. Reed Wiseman, Victor Glover, Christina Koch, and Jeremy Hansen. They launched from the same Florida coastline where Apollo left for the moon, riding a column of fire that shook the ground for miles. Their spacecraft, Orion, is hurtling through space at thousands of miles per hour, aimed directly at the moon. When they arrive, they'll fly close enough to see individual craters. Close enough to photograph the far side, the hemisphere that never faces Earth. Close enough that the surface will fill half their field of view. And then they'll turn around and come home. No landing. Let that sink in. We put humans on the moon in 1969. It took 8 years from President Kennedy's speech to Neil Armstrong's first step. 8 years. The smartphone in your pocket has more computing power than every machine NASA used during the entire Apollo program combined. We have reusable rockets now. We have telescopes that can see galaxies forming 13 billion years ago. We have mapped the lunar surface down to the meter. And yet, here we are, in 2026, watching 4 astronauts travel 250,000 miles, or 402,000 kilometers, to the moon, loop around it, and come straight home without touching the surface. The question everyone wants answered is simple. Why? That question has 3 answers, and none of them are simple. The first answer involves engineering. The spacecraft that could land humans on the moon doesn't exist yet. The second answer involves politics. The rocket carrying those 4 astronauts was designed by a congressional act to preserve jobs, not to optimize for lunar exploration. The third answer involves risk. After 2 shuttle disasters that took 14 lives, NASA's tolerance for acceptable danger changed fundamentally. Understanding those 3 answers means understanding how space exploration actually works in the 21st century. Not the idealized version where brilliant engineers solve impossible problems. The real version, where billion-dollar rockets get designed by committee and launch schedules get determined by budget analysts. Let's start with the most straightforward piece. The simplest reason Artemis II won't land is that the lunar lander doesn't exist yet. Apollo was elegant in its architecture. Everything launched together on a single rocket, the Saturn V. The command module where the crew lived, the service module that provided propulsion, and the lunar module that landed on the surface. All stacked together, riding one vehicle to the moon. One rocket, one launch, one mission. If you had the crew, the capsule, and the lander, you loaded everything onto Saturn V and went to the moon. Period. Artemis doesn't work that way. The Artemis architecture splits the crew vehicle from the landing vehicle into two entirely separate systems that have to meet in space. The crew rides to the moon aboard Orion, launched on the Space Launch System. The lander is a modified version of SpaceX's Starship, called the Human Landing System. These two vehicles launch separately, on different rockets, at different times. They have to rendezvous in lunar orbit before anyone can descend to the surface. And here's where the complexity multiplies. Before Starship can even leave Earth orbit, it needs fuel. Starship is enormous, the largest rocket ever built. Getting it to the moon requires filling it with liquid methane and liquid oxygen while it's already in orbit. That means SpaceX has to launch somewhere between 10 and 16 separate tanker flights, each one docking with the lander and transferring propellant in zero gravity. This process, called orbital propellant transfer, has never been done at this scale. SpaceX completed a small demonstration in 2025, transferring a few hundred kilograms of fluid. But that's very different from operating a functional gas station in orbit and filling a spacecraft 15 stories tall. Let me walk you through what an actual Artemis III landing would require, because the sequence reveals just how far we've moved from Apollo's simplicity. First, SpaceX launches a Starship depot to low Earth orbit. This is essentially a massive fuel tank in space. It parks in orbit and waits. Then, the tanker campaign begins. 10 to 16 separate Starship launches, each one docking with the depot and offloading cryogenic propellant. Liquid methane boils at -320 degrees Fahrenheit, or -196 degrees Celsius. Liquid oxygen boils at -297 degrees Fahrenheit, or -183 degrees Celsius. In orbit, where one side of the spacecraft faces the Sun at +250 degrees Fahrenheit, or +121 degrees Celsius, and the other side faces deep space at -250 degrees Fahrenheit, or -157 degrees Celsius. Keeping those propellants from boiling away during weeks or months of operations represents an engineering challenge no one has solved at this scale. Once the depot is full, the propellant transfers to Starship. The lander then fires its engines and departs for the moon, entering what's called a near-rectilinear halo orbit. This highly elliptical path brings it close to the lunar surface at its lowest point. The lander parks there and waits for the crew. Meanwhile, on a completely separate timeline, the Space Launch System launches Orion with astronauts aboard. The crew flies to the moon on essentially the same trajectory Artemis II is following right now. Orion enters the same orbit as Starship, and the two vehicles rendezvous. They dock, and two crew members transfer from Orion into the lander. The other two stay in Orion, orbiting alone, waiting for their colleagues to return. The lander descends to the surface for a mission currently planned to last about a week. After the surface operations, the two astronauts reboard the lander, launch from the moon, ascend back to orbit, rendezvous with Orion again, transfer back, and Orion departs for Earth. The entire sequence requires two separate launch campaigns, more than a dozen individual rocket launches, multiple orbital rendezvous in two different orbits, and a surface landing and ascent. All of this must succeed sequentially, with no single failure allowed. Compare that to Apollo. Launch, Saturn V. Fly to moon. Enter orbit. Land. Come back. One rocket, one launch, one sequence. The Artemis architecture isn't more complex because the engineering is better. It's more complex because the foundational vehicle, the Space Launch System, can't carry everything at once. And that limitation cascades through the entire mission design. That's the engineering answer for why Artemis II isn't landing. But it doesn't explain why the architecture was designed this way in the first place. It doesn't explain why we went from a single rocket that could do the entire job in 1969 to a system requiring 2 separate rockets, a dozen refueling flights, and orbital rendezvous just to put 2 people on the surface. To understand that, we need to go back to a piece of legislation signed in 2010. In 2011, the Space Shuttle flew for the last time. After 30 years of service, 135 missions, and 2 catastrophic losses, Challenger in 1986 and Columbia in 2003, the program ended. NASA had been working on a replacement called Constellation, announced by President George W. Bush in 2004. Constellation was designed to send humans back to the Moon by 2020. It included a new crew capsule called Orion, a heavy-lift rocket called Ares V, and a lunar lander called Altair. The whole architecture was built specifically for returning to the Moon and eventually going to Mars. By 2010, Constellation had spent $9 billion. A review panel concluded the program was over budget, behind schedule, and unlikely to achieve its goals with available funding. President Obama cancelled Constellation in 2010. $9 billion gone. The lunar lander gone. The heavy-lift rocket gone. Only Orion survived, too far along in development to cancel without losing almost as much money as finishing it would cost. Congress was not happy about this cancellation. Not because of deep commitment to lunar exploration, but because Constellation employed tens of thousands of people across multiple states. Solid rocket boosters were built in Utah. The core stage was manufactured in Louisiana. Engines and integration happened in Alabama. These weren't just jobs. They were jobs in the districts of powerful senators and representatives who controlled NASA's budget. Congress responded by passing the 2010 NASA Authorization Act. Embedded in that legislation was a very specific instruction. NASA's next heavy-lift rocket must use existing space shuttle hardware, infrastructure, and workforce. The solid rocket boosters from the shuttle program. The RS-25 engines from the shuttle program. The manufacturing facilities that built shuttle components. The workforce that assembled them. Congress didn't just tell NASA to build a rocket. Congress told NASA how to build it, what parts to use, which factories to keep open, which contractors to preserve. The result was the Space Launch System. And the Space Launch System wasn't designed around a mission. It was designed around a supply chain. The numbers tell the real story. The Space Launch System can deliver approximately 59,500 pounds to translunar injection, the trajectory that sends spacecraft toward the Moon. Saturn V could deliver approximately 107,000 pounds to the same trajectory. Nearly double. Saturn V could carry the crew capsule, the service module, and the lunar module, all on a single launch. The Space Launch System cannot. It can carry Orion and its service module, and that's essentially it. There's no room for a lander because the rocket doesn't have the payload capacity. And the cost. Saturn V, adjusted for inflation to 2026 dollars, cost roughly $1.5 billion per launch. NASA flew it 13 times in 4 years. The Space Launch System costs approximately $4.1 billion per launch. That's the rocket, the Orion capsule, and the ground systems, according to NASA's own Office of Inspector General. And NASA can fly it roughly once per year. We're looking at a rocket that costs nearly 3 times as much as Saturn V, flies far less often, and carries significantly less payload. But it keeps the same factories open and the same workforce employed. That $4.1 billion figure covers production of the rocket itself, the Orion spacecraft, ground infrastructure at Kennedy Space Center, and operational costs. It doesn't include the research and development costs already spent developing the system. Those sunk costs, spread across more than a decade, pushed total program expenditure into the tens of billions. By the time Artemis II launched, the United States had spent somewhere north of $90 billion on the Artemis Program, counting Space Launch System development, Orion development, ground systems upgrades, the Human Landing System contracts, and spacesuits. $90 billion. For context, the entire Apollo program from Kennedy's speech to the last moon landing cost approximately $25 billion in 1960s currency. That's roughly $250 billion in today's dollars. Apollo delivered 12 crewed missions, 6 moon landings, and 842 pounds of lunar samples. Artemis has delivered 1 uncrewed test flight and 1 crewed flyby, with the first landing still at least a year away. Is that comparison entirely fair? No. The economics of spaceflight have changed. Labor costs are different. Safety standards are different. The regulatory environment is different. Apollo was a crash program with wartime urgency and essentially unlimited funding during a period of economic growth. Artemis is a peacetime program operating under continuing resolutions and budget constraints. But the comparison reveals something real. The system that produces the Space Launch System isn't designed to be cost-effective. It's designed to be politically durable. The workforce argument is the most politically potent piece. The Space Launch System sustains approximately 30,000 jobs across 44 states, according to NASA's own economic impact reports. Those are real people doing real work. The engineers at Stennis Space Center testing the RS-25 engines aren't padding their hours. The technicians at the Michoud assembly facility welding the core stage tankage aren't performing fake work. The solid rocket booster specialists at Northrop Grumman's facility in Promontory, Utah, are building real hardware. The work is real. The rocket is real. But the question isn't whether the work is real. The question is whether the rocket is the right one. When Congress wrote the 2010 Authorization Act, they made a choice. They chose to preserve the industrial base over optimizing the mission. And once that choice was made, everything that followed was downstream of that original decision. The 2-launch architecture, the Starship dependency, the 10 to 16 refueling flights, the $4 billion per launch price tag. All consequences of designing a rocket around leftover shuttle parts instead of designing it for lunar capability. The lander isn't ready because the rocket can't carry one. The rocket can't carry one because it was designed around shuttle components. The shuttle components were mandated because Congress wanted to save jobs. It's a chain of decisions, each one rational in its own context, that collectively produced an architecture optimized for political survival rather than exploration capability. That's not corruption. It's how the American political system processes expensive, long-duration technical programs. But it's also why Artemis needs two separate launches to do what Apollo did in one. Now, you might be thinking, okay, the architecture isn't ideal, but why not just accept more risk and move faster the way Apollo did? The answer involves a shift in philosophy that's just as important as the shift in hardware. During the Apollo program, NASA internally estimated the probability of losing a crew at roughly 1 in 10 per mission. 1 in 10. That means for every flight to the moon, there was approximately a 10% chance the astronauts wouldn't come home. And they flew anyway, 12 times. The reason they accepted that risk was context. The Cold War wasn't a metaphor. The Soviet Union had beaten the United States to every major spaceflight milestone. First satellite, first human in orbit, first spacewalk, first woman in space. In the strategic calculus of the 1960s, losing the moon race was considered a national security concern. The risk of astronaut deaths was weighed against the risk of conceding technological supremacy to the Soviets. In that framework, 1 in 10 was acceptable. That framework no longer exists. Two disasters changed NASA's institutional relationship with risk in ways that still shape decisions today. On January 28, 1986, the Space Shuttle Challenger broke apart 73 seconds after launch when an O-ring in the right solid rocket booster failed in cold weather. 7 crew members were lost, including Krista McAuliffe, who would have been the first teacher in space. The investigation revealed that NASA managers had overridden engineer warnings about the O-ring's performance in low temperatures. The agency had accepted risk it should not have accepted, and 7 people were lost because of it. 17 years later, on February 1st, 2003, the Space Shuttle Columbia disintegrated during re-entry when a piece of foam insulation struck the leading edge of the left wing during launch. Superheated plasma entered the wing during re-entry, and the orbiter broke apart over Texas. 7 more crew members were lost. Again, the investigation found that NASA's organizational culture had normalized risk, treating foam strikes as a maintenance issue rather than a safety threat. After Columbia, NASA's relationship with acceptable risk fundamentally changed. The agency implemented new safety frameworks, oversight boards, and mandatory risk assessments at every stage. The current Artemis program targets a crew loss probability of 1 in 30 per mission. That's roughly 3 times safer than what Apollo accepted. In March of 2026, just weeks before Artemis II launched, an independent analysis estimated the actual crew loss probability for this mission at somewhere between 1 in 2 and 1 in 50, depending on assumptions about the heat shield. 1 in 2 at the pessimistic end means a coin flip. 1 in 50 at the optimistic end is still more dangerous than Apollo. The truth is probably somewhere in between, and the honest answer is that nobody knows exactly where, because this spacecraft has never flown with crew at lunar return velocity. The heat shield is the most visible symbol of this tension between caution and urgency. When Orion returned from its uncrewed test flight on Artemis I in November of 2022, the Avcoat ablative heat shield behaved unexpectedly. Pieces of the ablative material broke away in a process called charring and spalling. The material cracked and separated in ways the models hadn't predicted. NASA's Office of Inspector General identified 3 potential crew kill mechanisms. Direct breach in the thermal protection system. debris from the shield striking the parachute risers. Structural damage from uneven heating. NASA's response was not to redesign the heat shield. There wasn't enough time or budget for that. Instead, they modified the re-entry trajectory, using a shallower approach angle and a different skip profile to reduce thermal stress on the material. Same shield, different angle. And then they put 4 humans on top of it. In January of 2026, NASA Administrator Jared Isaacman reviewed the analysis and gave the green light to fly. In February, Isaacman went further, cancelling the planned Space Launch System upgrades entirely and standardizing the program on the current configuration. The stated reason was risk reduction and schedule stability. But some read it as an admission that the program couldn't afford to develop more powerful versions of a rocket that already costs $4 billion per flight. This is what the price of caution looks like. NASA wants to move fast, but the institutional memory of Challenger and Columbia, 14 crew members lost because risk was normalized, has created a culture where every decision gets weighed against the question, can we defend this if it goes wrong? And that question, applied rigorously enough, slows everything down. Artemis I was uncrewed. Artemis II is crewed but doesn't land. Artemis III will be the first landing attempt. Each mission is a gate, and the next one doesn't open until the previous one proves the hardware works. Apollo skipped many of those gates because the geopolitical stakes of losing the moon race were judged higher than the human stakes of losing a crew. We made a different choice this time. Whether it's the right choice depends on what happens next. So those are the 3 reasons. Engineering. The lander doesn't exist, and the architecture requires orbital gymnastics Apollo never needed. Politics. Congress designed a rocket around jobs instead of missions. Risk. We're not willing to accept the danger levels that Apollo lived with. But understanding why Artemis II can't land is only part of the story. The other part is understanding who's making this journey and what they're experiencing right now. Let's talk about the 4 people strapped inside that spacecraft. Reed Wiseman is the commander, a Navy test pilot with 165 days in space from a 2014 mission to the International Space Station. Between 2020 and 2022, he served as NASA's chief astronaut, the person responsible for evaluating other astronauts' readiness for flight. Now he's in the seat himself, on the most consequential test flight NASA has conducted since the shuttle. Victor Glover is the pilot, also a Navy test pilot. In November of 2020, Glover rode SpaceX's Crew Dragon to the space station, spending 167 days on orbit. On Artemis II, Glover becomes the first black astronaut to fly on a lunar mission. Not the first black astronaut in space, that was Guion Bluford in 1983, but the first to leave low Earth orbit, the first to see the moon up close, the first to travel farther from Earth than any person of color in history. Christina Koch is Mission Specialist 1, an electrical engineer who spent years building space instruments before becoming an astronaut. In March of 2019, Koch launched to the space station and didn't come home until February of 2020. 328 consecutive days in space, the longest single spaceflight by a woman in history. In October of 2019, she and fellow astronaut Jessica Meir conducted the first all-female spacewalk. Koch knows what it's like to live in a spacecraft for the better part of a year. Her long-duration experience is directly relevant to validating Orion's life support systems. On Artemis II, She becomes the first woman to travel beyond low Earth orbit. Jeremy Hansen is Mission Specialist 2, Canadian Space Agency, CF-18 fighter pilot, and geologist. And here's what makes his presence remarkable. Artemis II is his first spaceflight. He's never been to space before. His first time leaving the planet, and he's going to the moon. Not low Earth orbit, not the space station, the moon. He'll be the first Canadian to travel beyond low Earth orbit and the first Canadian to see the far side of the moon. And he's doing it as a rookie. Think about what that means. Hansen has trained for years in simulators, underwater analogs, and centrifuges. But until the launch, he'd never felt an actual liftoff, never experienced microgravity, never looked out a window and seen Earth's curve. His first experience of all that is happening on a mission that will take him farther from home than 99.999% of all humans who have ever lived. The pressure on Hansen is immense, not just physical, but psychological. He's representing an entire nation that has never sent someone beyond low Earth orbit. Chris Hadfield became a celebrity for his International Space Station videos, singing David Bowie's Space Oddity while floating in the cupola. Roberta Bondar flew on the shuttle in 1992, conducting experiments in microgravity. But no Canadian has ever left Earth orbit, never traveled through deep space, never seen the moon up close. Hansen carries that weight, the knowledge that millions of people back home are watching, hoping, invested in his success. Every photo he takes, every observation he makes, every moment he experiences will be shared with a nation that sees this as their mission too. And he has to do it while being the rookie, the least experienced person in the capsule, learning on the fly. But Hansen has an advantage that experience can't provide: fresh eyes. He's noticing things veteran astronauts might overlook because they've become routine. That perspective is valuable on a test flight where the goal is to identify anything unexpected. Wiseman knows this, and he's deliberately giving Hansen latitude to observe, to question, to point out things that seem odd. The crew dynamics matter more than most people realize. NASA psychologists spent months evaluating how this specific group would work together under stress. They ran simulations, created conflict scenarios, observed communication patterns during emergencies. Wiseman's leadership style is calm and methodical, shaped by years as a test pilot where emotional reactions get people killed. Glover brings energy and optimism that counterbalances the weight of the mission. His presence lifts spirits when tension builds, when frustration creeps in, when the walls feel like they're closing in. Koch's experience gives her authority that goes beyond rank. When she says something feels wrong, people listen, because she's lived in space longer than the other three combined. And Hansen, despite being the rookie, asks questions that veterans might not think to ask. In confined spaces, personality conflicts escalate fast. Small annoyances become major frustrations when you can't escape them. The way someone chews, the sounds they make sleeping, their habits and quirks. All of it magnified by proximity and stress and the knowledge that you're stuck together for 10 days. But this crew was selected because they work well together. They communicate clearly. They've developed shorthand from years of training. They trust each other. That trust isn't abstract, it's concrete. Wiseman trusts Glover to execute a navigation burn precisely. Glover trusts Koch to diagnose life support anomalies before they become critical. Koch trusts Hansen to document observations accurately. Hansen trusts Wiseman to make the right call when seconds matter. That web of trust is what keeps missions alive when things go wrong. These 4 people are strapped into a spacecraft roughly the volume of a minivan. They'll live, work, eat, sleep, and use a single toilet together for 10 days. There's no privacy, no separate room, no going outside for a walk when the walls start closing in. Every conversation is heard by everyone. Every meal is shared. Every sleep cycle is communal, with sleeping bags mounted to the walls, inches from each other. This isn't the space station, where crew members have individual sleeping quarters and multiple modules to spread out in. Orion is a test capsule, designed to get crew to the moon and back, not to provide comfort. The interior is packed with equipment, racks of avionics, storage compartments, and the consumables that keep 4 humans alive. Free-floating space is limited. Movement requires careful choreography, so 2 people aren't trying to occupy the same cubic meter at the same time. The crew exercises twice a day using resistance bands and isometric protocols, not because they enjoy it, but because the alternative is measurable physical degradation. Bone density loss begins within the first few days of microgravity exposure. Muscle atrophy follows. The heart, no longer working against gravity, begins to decondition. 10 days isn't long enough for these effects to become serious, but Orion's life support data will provide NASA with baseline physiological measurements for future longer missions. The crew wears biomedical sensors that track heart rate, blood oxygen, sleep quality, and radiation dose in real time. Every heartbeat, every breath, every hour of sleep is data. These 4 people aren't just crew, they're test subjects. Let me walk you through what's happening right now, at this moment, as the crew coasts toward the moon. 3 days after launch, Orion is already farther from Earth than the International Space Station has ever been. The Earth, which filled their windows at launch, is smaller now. You could cover it with your thumb if you held your hand at arm's length. The stars, washed out by Earth's reflected light during the first day, are becoming more vivid. The Milky Way appears as a river of light arcing across the viewport with a clarity no one on Earth's surface ever sees. The moon is growing, no longer a dot, but a disk. You can start to make out features, the dark Maria and the brighter cratered highlands. Inside Orion, the crew floats. Microgravity has been the baseline since the translunar injection burn ended. By day 3, the body has started to adapt. Fluids shift upward, faces puff slightly, sinuses feel congested. The head feels full, in a way that never quite resolves. The crew eats pre-packaged meals, exercises against elastic bands, runs system checks, and talks to Houston. The food situation is more complex than just opening packages. Every meal has been planned months in advance, balanced for nutrition, variety, and crew preferences. NASA nutritionists calculated caloric needs based on activity levels, accounting for the fact that the body burns slightly fewer calories in microgravity. Each crew member selected their menu before launch, rating different food items, indicating preferences and dislikes. The galley isn't really a galley. It's a storage locker with a water dispenser. Meals come in several forms. Thermostabilized pouches that have been heat-treated to kill bacteria, freeze-dried packets that need water added, irradiated foods that can be eaten without heating, and natural form items like nuts and cookies. The thermostabilized meals are the closest thing to real food. Things like beef, stew, chicken and rice, scrambled eggs. You cut the pouch open, squeeze the food onto a spoon, and eat it directly. The freeze-dried meals require hot or cold water injected through a valve in the package. You add the water, knead the package to mix it, let it rehydrate for a few minutes, then cut it open and eat. The texture is never quite right. Freeze-dried food rehydrates unevenly. Some parts soggy and some parts still crunchy. But it's edible, and after a few days in space, your taste changes anyway. Fluid shift affects not just your sinuses, but your sense of taste and smell. Foods that tasted good on Earth taste bland in space. Astronauts tend to prefer spicier foods, hotter sauces, stronger flavors, anything to cut through the dampened taste. The crew brought hot sauce, Tabasco, packets of salt and pepper suspended in oil so they don't float away. Meals are communal when possible, all 4 crew members eating together, floating in a rough circle, talking about the day's activities or what they're seeing out the windows. It's important psychologically that shared time, the ritual of breaking bread together, even when the bread is freeze-dried and eaten from a pouch. It maintains the social bonds that keep a crew functioning as a team rather than 4 isolated individuals. Cleanup is minimal but necessary. Used packages go into a trash compactor that squeezes them down to reduce volume. Spoons and utensils get wiped clean with sanitizing wipes. There's no water to spare for washing dishes. And waste, both food waste and human waste, becomes a logistics concern. The toilet on Orion is a marvel of engineering and a source of endless frustration. It's a vacuum system that uses airflow to direct waste into collection bags. Using it requires practice, getting positioned correctly, making sure the seal is tight, activating the airflow. In microgravity, nothing falls naturally, so everything has to be pulled or pushed where it needs to go. The system works, but it's not pleasant, and privacy is minimal. There's a curtain for visual privacy, but sound carries in the small cabin. Everyone hears everything, one of those realities of spaceflight that doesn't make it into the recruitment videos. Hygiene is similarly constrained. There are no showers, water is too precious to use for bathing. Instead, the crew uses wet wipes, no-rinse soap, and dry shampoo. You wipe yourself down, trying to remove sweat and dead skin, but you never feel truly clean. After a few days, everyone smells, the cabin smells, and you just get used to it. The environmental control system filters the air, removes odors to some extent, but it can't eliminate everything. The smell of human bodies, of the food, of the off-gassing from equipment and materials, all of it blends into a distinctive scent that veteran astronauts recognize immediately. It's the smell of spaceflight, not glamorous, just real. But the conversations with Houston are different now. At lunar distance, a radio signal takes approximately 1.3 seconds to reach Earth. That's a 2.6-second round-trip delay. Try having a conversation where every response arrives almost 3 seconds after you finish speaking. The natural rhythm of human dialogue breaks down completely. And it gets worse as distance increases. For the majority of the transit, the crew is outside Earth's magnetosphere, the magnetic field that shields the space station and everything in low Earth orbit. Once past the Van Allen radiation belts, which Orion traversed in the first several hours after launch, the crew is exposed to the full deep space radiation environment. Galactic cosmic rays are the baseline. These high-energy particles, protons, alpha particles, and heavier atomic nuclei are accelerated to enormous speeds by supernovae and other violent events across the galaxy. They come from every direction and pass through the spacecraft walls like the walls aren't there. You can't feel them, can't see them, but they're passing through the crew's bodies constantly, occasionally striking DNA, occasionally depositing enough energy to damage a cell. Over a 10-day mission, the cumulative dose is modest but non-zero, and its exposure no human has experienced since the last Apollo crew came home in December of 1972. The bigger risk is a solar particle event. If the sun erupts and a coronal mass ejection happens to be pointed at the corridor between Earth and the Moon, the crew could be hit by a wave of high-energy protons arriving within minutes to hours. A near miss in August of 1972 between Apollo 16 and 17 produced an estimated radiation dose that could have caused acute radiation sickness, organ failure, and death within days. Had astronauts been on the lunar surface during that event, they almost certainly wouldn't have survived. Artemis II is flying during solar maximum, the peak of solar cycle 25, which has been running higher and more active than forecasts predicted. The probability of a significant event during the 10-day mission window isn't negligible. Orion carries a radiation shelter protocol. If a major event is detected, the crew moves to the center of the spacecraft, surrounds themselves with water containers and equipment bags, and waits it out. This isn't a radiation vault. There's no lead-lined chamber inside Orion. It's a damage reduction measure, using the mass of supplies to absorb some incoming particles and reduce the dose. It's the best they can do with the spacecraft they have. The strangest thing about deep space travel is how quiet it is. Not silence in the literal sense. Inside Orion, fans run constantly, circulating air through carbon dioxide scrubbers. The environmental control system hums. Pumps cycle coolant through thermal regulation loops. There's always mechanical noise. But outside, beyond the thin aluminum and composite walls, there's nothing. No wind, no friction, no sound of engines, because the engines are off. After the trans-lunar injection burn, Orion coasts. It's moving at tremendous speed, but with nothing to push against, there's no sensation of movement. Einstein's equivalence principle in action. In a spacecraft coasting through free space, there's no way to distinguish between floating in zero gravity and being at rest. The crew feels weightless, the spacecraft feels still, and the only evidence they're moving comes from looking out the window and watching Earth get smaller, the Moon get larger, and the stars wheel slowly overhead as the spacecraft rotates in its barbecue roll. That barbecue roll is a slow axial spin designed to distribute solar heating evenly across the hull. It creates something strange in the cabin. Because the spacecraft is rotating, the sun passes across the windows periodically. Light, then shadow. Light, then shadow. A slow rhythm that Apollo crews described as oddly hypnotic. On the sunlit side, surfaces warm. On the shadowed side, they cool. The thermal gradient can be significant. Space-facing surfaces dropping toward minus 250 degrees Fahrenheit or minus 157 degrees Celsius. Sun-facing surfaces climbing toward plus 250 degrees Fahrenheit or plus 121 degrees Celsius. The roll keeps any single surface from overheating or freezing, a simple, elegant solution to a fundamental problem of spaceflight. The thermal management system on Orion is a marvel of engineering simplicity. In space, there's no air to conduct heat away, So all thermal control has to happen through radiation. Hot surfaces radiate infrared energy into space, cooling themselves. Cold surfaces absorb any available radiation and warm up. The challenge is that the sun provides intense heating on one side, while deep space provides infinite cold on the other. Without the barbecue roll, one side of Orion would bake while the other froze. The temperature differential could exceed 500 degrees Fahrenheit or 278 degrees Celsius. That thermal stress would warp the structure, damage seals, potentially crack the pressure vessel. The roll distributes the heating evenly, rotating slowly enough that no single spot gets too hot or too cold. The rotation rate is carefully calculated based on the spacecraft's thermal properties, its surface area, its distance from the sun. Too fast, and you waste propellant maintaining the spin. Too slow, and you get thermal gradients that stress the structure. The optimal rate for Orion is roughly 1 rotation every few minutes, slow enough that you barely perceive it inside the capsule. From the crew's perspective, the sun appears to move across the windows in a slow, hypnotic pattern. Sunlight fills one window, then gradually moves to the next as the capsule rotates. When the sun is shining through a window, that window gets warm to the touch. When it's in shadow, it cools rapidly, becoming cold enough that condensation might form if there was enough humidity. The environmental control system manages this, keeping the cabin atmosphere at a comfortable 70 degrees Fahrenheit or 21 degrees Celsius, regardless of what's happening outside. But the crew can feel the thermal cycle, warm and cool, a reminder that they're floating through a vacuum where the difference between life and death is measured in millimeters of insulation. You're simultaneously being baked and frozen, and the only thing protecting you is a slow spin and a few layers of insulation. And through it all, the communication delay is growing. Every hour, Earth is farther away. Every hour, the round-trip delay between speaking and hearing a response gets a fraction of a second longer. By the time the crew reaches the moon, Houston's voice will arrive with a noticeable lag. Not enough to break communication entirely, but enough to make every exchange feel slightly disconnected. Every question takes a beat too long to get an answer. And when the crew swings behind the moon, even that delayed connection disappears completely. The journey to the moon takes roughly 4 days. 4 days of floating, eating, exercising, monitoring systems, talking to Houston with increasing delay, watching Earth shrink and the moon grow. 4 days of mechanical routine, punctuated by moments of profound strangeness. Looking out the window and seeing your entire world reduced to something you could cover with your thumb. Floating in the middle of the cabin and realizing there's no up or down, no floor or ceiling, just arbitrary designations on surfaces that all feel the same. Trying to sleep while strapped to a wall, listening to the hum of fans and the breathing of 3 other people inches away. Knowing that outside these thin walls is a void that would kill you in seconds. The psychological weight of deep space travel isn't fear, exactly. It's awareness. Awareness of how far you are from home. Awareness of how thin the margin is between functioning spacecraft and catastrophic failure. Awareness that if something goes seriously wrong, there's no rescue mission, no abort to a safe harbor. Just you and your crewmates, and whatever you can jury-rig from the equipment you have. Apollo 13 survived because the crew and mission control improvised solutions to problems no one had anticipated. They used the lunar module as a lifeboat, rationed power and water, built a carbon dioxide scrubber from spare parts and duct tape. They made it home by the narrowest of margins. Every deep space crew since then knows that story. They know how close it came to ending differently. And they know that if they face a similar crisis, their survival will depend on the same combination of skill, creativity, and luck. That knowledge sits in the back of your mind, not paralyzing, but present. A quiet understanding that you're operating on the edge of human capability, in an environment that's fundamentally hostile to life, kept alive only by technology that has to work perfectly for 10 straight days. The crew doesn't dwell on this. They can't afford to. Instead, they focus on the checklist, on the next task, on the immediate work that needs doing. That's how you get through it. Not by thinking about everything that could go wrong, but by doing the job in front of you and trusting that the people who designed this spacecraft knew what they were doing. On or around the 5th day after launch, Orion will reach the moon. And what happens next is the part of this mission that will stay with these 4 astronauts for the rest of their lives. The spacecraft approaches from behind, coming around the far side on a trajectory that will carry it to within approximately 4,600 miles of the surface. Close enough to see individual craters. Close enough that the surface fills the lower half of their field of view. And it's the far side, the hemisphere that never faces Earth. As Orion passes behind the moon, the spacecraft loses all contact with our planet. This isn't a technical failure. It's physics. The moon is 2,160 miles in diameter, or 3,476 kilometers. A wall of rock that physically blocks every radio frequency between the spacecraft and Earth. For approximately 45 minutes, the crew will be completely, utterly alone. No voice from Houston, no telemetry flowing back to mission control, no ability to call for help, and no ability for anyone on Earth to reach them. The silence is total. Only 24 humans in history have experienced this. The crews of Apollo 8, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, and 17. When Wiseman, Glover, Koch, and Hansen swing behind the moon, they'll become humans 25 through 28 to see the far side with their own eyes. And what they see will look nothing like the moon, you know. The near side, the face we see from Earth every night, is defined by Maria, those dark, smooth patches that give the man in the moon its shape. These ancient lava plains, the remains of volcanic eruptions that flooded enormous impact basins billions of years ago, cover roughly 31% of the near side. The far side has almost none. Maria cover approximately 1.6% of the far side surface. Instead, what you see from orbit is overwhelming, relentless cratering. Craters on top of craters, on top of craters. Layer upon layer of impacts, accumulated over 4 billion years, with no volcanic floods to smooth them over. The surface is brighter than the near side. The highland material is lighter in color than the dark volcanic basalt, and it gives the far side an alien quality that photographs don't fully capture. From 4,600 miles up, or 7,400 kilometers, it looks like a world that's been hit by everything the solar system could throw at it, and simply endured. The dominant feature is the South Pole Aitken Basin. This structure is 1,550 miles across, or 2,500 kilometers, and roughly 5 to 7.5 miles deep, or 8 to 12 kilometers. It's the largest confirmed impact structure in the entire solar system. Something enormous hit the Moon approximately 4.3 billion years ago, punching a hole so catastrophic it should have exposed the mantle beneath the crust. And yet, and this is one of the great unsolved mysteries of lunar science, the expected mantle material is missing. Buried beneath the basin floor, detected by gravity mapping, is a mass anomaly weighing approximately 2.4 quintillion kilograms. That's a concentration of dense material embedded in the lunar interior. The leading explanation is that it's the metallic core of the impactor that created the basin. A piece of the asteroid or protoplanetary body that hit the Moon 4 billion years ago, still embedded in the mantle like a bullet lodged in bone. The South Pole Aitken Basin isn't just a crater, it's a window into the Moon's interior. When that massive impactor hit 4.3 billion years ago, it didn't just excavate surface rock. It punched through the entire lunar crust, roughly 30 miles thick in that region, and into the mantle beneath. The energy released was staggering, equivalent to trillions of nuclear weapons detonating simultaneously. The impact created a fireball that would have been visible from Earth if Earth had eyes to see it. Material ejected from the basin rained down across the entire lunar surface, creating secondary craters, depositing layers of ejecta that can still be identified in soil samples. Some of that material escaped the Moon's gravity entirely, hurling into space, possibly reaching Earth. Scientists have speculated that some of the oldest impact spherules found in Earth's ancient rock formations might be lunar material delivered by the South Pole Aitken impact. The basin floor should show mantle composition, rocks richer in iron and magnesium than the crustal anorthosite. But spectroscopic analysis from orbit shows something more complex. The floor isn't uniformly mantle material, it's a mix. Some areas show the expected iron-rich minerals, olivine and pyroxene characteristic of mantle rock. But other areas look more like crustal material, as if the basin filled partially with melted and fractured crust rather than exposing pristine mantle. This suggests the impact was so violent that it mixed layers together, creating a geological mess that doesn't fit simple models. And then there's the mass anomaly, that buried concentration of dense material creating a gravitational bump. The Grail spacecraft mapped lunar gravity with unprecedented precision, flying in formation with a twin spacecraft and measuring tiny variations in the distance between them. Those variations revealed mass concentrations beneath the surface, and the South Pole Aitken anomaly is the largest. 2.4 quintillion kilograms of something denser than surrounding rock. If it's the impactor's core, it tells us something profound about the physics of giant impacts. It means the core material survived intact enough to sink rather than vaporizing or mixing uniformly into the mantle. It means the Moon's mantle was hot enough and ductile enough 4 billion years ago to allow dense material to settle through it. It means we're looking at a fossil, a remnant of planetary violence, frozen in place for 4 billion years. But we can't know for certain without landing there, without drilling into the basin floor, without deploying seismometers that can map the subsurface structure. China's Chang'e missions have already started this work remotely, but human geologists with tools could accomplish in days what robots take years to do. The South Pole Aitken Basin is one of the prime targets for Artemis III and beyond. Not just because it's scientifically valuable, but because its permanently shadowed craters near the rim might contain water ice. Water that's been trapped in darkness for billions of years, shielded from the sun's heat, preserved as a resource for future missions. For the crew of Artemis II flying overhead, the basin is a reminder of what's still to come. They're seeing it from altitude, photographing it, documenting it, but not touching it. That's for the next mission, the landing mission, if it happens. For the crew inside Orion, this passage over the far side will last roughly 45 minutes. 45 minutes of total isolation. No voice from Houston, no data link, no ability to hear another human voice that isn't inside the capsule. Just the four of them for 3/4 of an hour. What does that silence feel like? The Apollo crews left some clues. Michael Collins, who orbited the moon alone in the command module, while Armstrong and Aldrin walked on the surface during Apollo 11, described his far-side passes as the most profound moments of his life. Not the loneliest, Collins always pushed back against that characterization, but the most clarifying. On the far side, with Earth hidden and the surface of an ancient world rolling past below, normal hierarchies of importance seemed to flatten. What remained was simpler. The universe is large, you're small, and you're seeing something almost no one has ever seen. Jim Lovell, who flew behind the moon twice, once on Apollo 8 and once on the nearly fatal Apollo 13, described the far side silence not as frightening, but as absolute. The absence of communication with Earth didn't feel like abandonment. It felt like concentration, as if the universe had cleared the room so you could pay attention to what was in front of you. For the crew of Artemis II, the far side passage adds a dimension that Apollo lacked. These four astronauts have spent their entire adult lives connected. Phones, email, mission loops, social media, family group chats. They're the most connected generation of astronauts ever to fly. And for 45 minutes, all of that stops. Not because a network goes down, but because a world gets in the way. 2,160 miles of rock, the physical body of the moon, stands between them and every other human being alive. There's no workaround, no satellite relay, no backup channel. The laws of physics enforce the silence, and no amount of technology can override them. In that silence, flying over the ancient, battered, waterless far side at 4,600 miles altitude, seeing craters that haven't changed in 3 billion years, feeling the absence of Earth in every window. Something shifts. Every Apollo astronaut who experienced it said the same thing in different words. It changes you. You leave Earth as a pilot, or an engineer, or a scientist. You come back as someone who has seen the overview. Someone who knows not intellectually, but physically, that humanity lives on a very thin surface of a very small world in a very large and very quiet universe. Imagine floating in that capsule. Earth is gone, hidden behind the moon. There's no blue marble in any window, just the lunar surface below and the stars above. The surface is grey and white, pockmarked, ancient, illuminated by sunlight with no atmosphere to soften it. Pure black shadows and blinding white highlights, with no gradient in between. You're seeing something only 24 other humans have ever seen. The silence in the cabin is broken only by the hum of the life support system, the occasional click of an instrument, and the sound of your own breathing. Mission control isn't there. Your family isn't there. The entire human race is behind a wall of rock 2,160 miles thick. For 45 minutes, you are the farthest thing from home that exists. And then, as the trajectory carries you around the curve of the far side, something begins to appear at the edge of the window. a sliver of blue, a crescent of light against the grey lunar horizon. Earth is rising. And in that moment, you see what only a handful of humans have ever seen. Your planet, your home, emerging from behind another world. On December 24th, 1968, Christmas Eve, the crew of Apollo 8 became the first humans to orbit the moon. Frank Borman, Jim Lovell, and William Anders had been circling the lifeless grey surface for hours, photographing potential landing sites. And then, on their fourth orbit, as the spacecraft came around the far side, William Anders looked up and saw something through the window that stopped him cold. Earth was rising over the lunar horizon. The cabin audio captured the moment. Borman saying, "Oh my, look at that picture over there." Anders, already shooting, replied, "Hand me that roll of color quick, would you?" What Anders captured became known as Earthrise, a photograph of a small, blue, fragile planet hanging above the barren grey curve of the moon. It's been called the most influential environmental photograph ever taken. It was the first time humanity saw itself from the outside, a single, borderless world floating in an infinite void. No countries visible, no wars visible, just life. A thin film of blue and white and green, the only color for 250,000 miles in any direction. That photograph changed something. Not in the science. The science already knew Earth was a planet orbiting a star, but in the culture. The environmental movement gained momentum. The first Earth Day was held 2 years later in 1970. People who had never thought about the fragility of their planet suddenly had an image that made that fragility visceral. The Earthrise moment isn't just visually stunning, it's emotionally devastating in a way that's hard to articulate. Every Apollo astronaut who saw it struggled to put the experience into words. They'd talk about the beauty, the fragility, the isolation of Earth against the void. But those words don't quite capture it. The experience goes deeper than language. It's seeing your entire world, everyone you've ever known, every human achievement, every war, every love story, every triumph and tragedy, reduced to a sphere you could cover with your thumb. Everything that seems important on Earth, the politics, the conflicts, the competitions, suddenly looks absurd from that distance. National borders aren't visible. The things people fight and die over are invisible from the moon. What you see is one world, one incredibly thin film of atmosphere, one fragile system keeping billions of people alive. And around it, nothing. No other planets with life visible anywhere. No backup worlds, no escape, no safety net. Just Earth, alone in an ocean of darkness. The Apollo 8 crew read from the Book of Genesis during their Christmas Eve broadcast, describing creation, the beginning of the world. It wasn't a political statement. It was the only words they could find that felt adequate to what they were seeing. Frank Borman ended the broadcast with, "And from the crew of Apollo 8, we close with good night, good luck, a Merry Christmas, and blessings to all of you. All of you on the good Earth. All of you on the good Earth." That phrase, the good Earth, became a touchstone. Not just our Earth, but the good Earth, the precious Earth, the Earth that deserves protection. When Wiseman, Glover, Koch, and Hansen see their Earthrise, they'll be carrying the weight of that history. They'll know what Anders felt, what Borman felt, what every lunar astronaut felt when seeing home from that perspective. And they'll bring that perspective back, share it through photographs and videos and interviews. In 2 days, The crew of Artemis II will see the same thing. They'll photograph it with cameras far more advanced than anything Anders had. They'll share it instantly with billions of people watching around the world. And, for a moment, we'll all see ourselves the way they see us. Small, fragile, alone, together. After the lunar flyby, Orion begins the coast back to Earth. The free return trajectory is doing its work. The moon's gravity has redirected the spacecraft, and it's now falling back toward home. Over the next 4 to 5 days, the crew will watch the moon shrink behind them and Earth grow ahead of them. The dynamic reverses. Earth goes from a small blue crescent to a growing disk that eventually fills the viewport. The journey home feels different than the journey out. Going to the moon, you're traveling toward a destination, towards something you're going to see and experience. Coming back, you're returning to everything familiar, but you're carrying something with you that you didn't have before. The memory of what you saw, the knowledge of what it feels like to be that far from home, the perspective that comes from seeing your world from the outside. Hansen, the rookie, will spend much of the return journey processing what he's experienced. His first spaceflight took him to the moon. He went from never leaving Earth to traveling farther than all but 24 humans in history. Koch will be thinking about what she saw on the far side, comparing it to the satellite images and photographs she studied during training, noting differences, documenting observations that might matter for future missions. Glover will be running through the re-entry procedures in his mind, going over the checklist, making sure he knows exactly what happens and when. Wiseman will be monitoring systems, watching for any anomalies, anything that suggests a problem developing. As commander, the weight of bringing everyone home safely sits on his shoulders. And somewhere, in those final hours, the crew has to prepare for the most violent phase of the entire mission: re-entry. Orion will hit Earth's atmosphere at approximately 25,000 miles per hour. That's roughly 6.9 miles per second. Mach 32. To put that in perspective, a bullet fired from a high-powered rifle travels at about half a mile per second. Orion is coming in at 14 times that speed. A commercial airliner cruises at about 560 miles per hour. Orion will be moving more than 44 times faster. This is the fastest re-entry speed any crewed vehicle has ever attempted with humans aboard. And it's significantly faster than the roughly 17,500 miles per hour. That spacecraft returning from the space station experience. This isn't a routine re-entry from low Earth orbit. This is lunar return velocity, and the physics are unforgiving. To manage the thermal load and the G-forces, Orion uses a technique called skip re-entry. Instead of plunging straight into the atmosphere and decelerating in one continuous descent, the capsule takes a more controlled approach. It dips into the upper atmosphere at a shallow angle, bleeding off some speed. The heat builds. The friction between the capsule and air generates a sheath of plasma around the vehicle, ionized gas so hot it glows. The exterior of the Avcoat heat shield reaches temperatures of approximately 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit, or 2,760 degrees Celsius. That's hot enough to melt steel, hot enough to melt titanium. The crew sits meters away from that inferno, separated by the thickness of the heat shield and the capsule structure. After the first dip, Orion skips back up, rises briefly out of the dense atmosphere like a stone skipping across a pond. This pause gives the heat shield a moment to cool, gives the crew a brief reduction in G-loading, and allows mission control to fine-tune the trajectory for the second entry. Then, the capsule plunges back in for the final descent. The G-forces build from the weightlessness of deep space to 4, 5, possibly 6 times the force of gravity. After 10 days of floating, the crew's bodies are suddenly pressed hard into their seats. Blood pools in their legs, vision narrows, breathing becomes effortful. This transition from 0G to high G is one of the most physiologically stressful things a human body can experience, and it happens in minutes. During the plasma phase, communications black out again. The ionized gas surrounding the capsule blocks radio signals just as the moon blocked them during the far side flyby. For several minutes, mission control hears nothing. The crew hears nothing from Earth. They're wrapped in a cocoon of superheated plasma, decelerating at enormous forces and completely alone. This is a different kind of silence from the far side blackout. The far side silence was peaceful, contemplative, a silence of distance. This silence is violent. The spacecraft is shaking. The heat shield is ablating, material burning away by design, carrying thermal energy away from the capsule. And the question that has hung over this entire program, will the heat shield hold, is being answered in real time. The modified trajectory that NASA implemented after the Artemis I anomaly is being tested right now. The shallower entry angle, the adjusted skip profile, all of it designed to reduce the thermal stress that caused the avcoat to crack and spall on the uncrewed flight. If the modifications work, the shield will ablate smoothly, the material charring and burning, but staying in place, protecting the crew. If they don't work, if the material cracks and breaks away in large pieces, the consequences could range from rougher than expected descent to catastrophic failure. The crew won't know which until they're through it. Mission control won't know until the blackout ends and telemetry starts flowing again. And everyone watching on the ground, the families, the engineers, the administrators who made the call to fly with the modified trajectory instead of redesigning the shield, they won't know until Orion emerges from the plasma and the parachutes deploy. The parachute deployment sequence is itself a choreographed series of events that has to work perfectly. At roughly 24,000 feet altitude, 2 drogue parachutes deploy first. Smaller chutes that stabilize the capsule and slow it from several hundred miles per hour to a more manageable descent rate. The drogues hold for about a minute, orienting Orion into proper attitude for main chute deployment. Then the drogue mortars fire, pulling the 3 pilot parachutes out, which in turn extract the 3 enormous main parachutes. Each main parachute is 116 feet in diameter when fully open, roughly the size of a football field if you could flatten all 3 of them out. They open in a stage sequence called reefing, where the canopy inflates partially at first, then fully, to prevent the shock of full deployment from tearing the fabric or snapping the risers. The opening loads are enormous. Tens of thousands of pounds of force transmitted through the suspension lines to the spacecraft. And this system has to work. All of it. Orion's parachute system is designed to be survivable with 2 of 3 main chutes. If one fails, the landing is harder but survivable. If 2 fail, the situation becomes critical. The heat shield debris risk is directly relevant here. If pieces of avcoat broke away during the re-entry burn and tumbled along the spacecraft's wake, they could potentially impact the parachute deployment system. A severed riser means a failed chute. 2 severed risers means 2 failed chutes. The modified re-entry trajectory is designed in part to reduce this risk by lowering peak heating and therefore reducing the amount of material that ablates away. But it's a risk that exists, and it's a risk that will be resolved in real time during the descent. Below the parachutes, the Pacific Ocean is waiting. The splashdown zone is off the coast of San Diego, selected for calm seas, proximity to naval recovery assets, and favorable weather patterns. The USS Portland, a San Antonio-class amphibious transport dock, is positioned in the recovery zone along with smaller support vessels, helicopters, and dive teams. When Orion touches down, the impact is absorbed partially by the capsule structure and partially by crushable ribs built into the heat shield, designed to deform on impact, dissipating energy the way a car's crumple zone does. The splashdown isn't gentle. Even with parachutes, the capsule hits the water hard, decelerating from about 20 miles per hour to 0 in a fraction of a second. The crew is braced, strapped tightly into their seats, but the impact is still jarring. A thud, a lurch, and then suddenly, they're floating again, but this time on water instead of in space. After splashdown, the capsule bobs in the swells. Recovery swimmers approach in rigid hull inflatable boats, attach a collar around the capsule to stabilize it, verify the exterior is safe, and begin the process of opening the hatch. The first thing the crew will feel when the hatch opens is wind, salt air, the smell of the ocean. After 10 days of recycled atmosphere inside Orion, air scrubbed of carbon dioxide, filtered, temperature-controlled, and utterly sterile, the sensory shock of fresh ocean air will be enormous. Then, they're out, lifted by basket into a helicopter or walked across a ramp onto the recovery ship, depending on their physical condition. Medical teams are standing by. The recovery operation is a carefully orchestrated ballet involving Navy divers, helicopters, ships, and medical personnel. The USS Portland isn't just positioned in the recovery zone, it's equipped with a well deck, a floodable compartment at the stern that can be partially submerged. The well deck allows small boats and recovery craft to enter and exit the ship without using cranes. For Orion recovery, the plan is to use rigid hull inflatable boats to approach the capsule, secure it, and either tow it into the well deck or transfer the crew via helicopter. The decision depends on sea state, crew condition, and weather. Recovery swimmers are the first to reach Orion, launching from the rigid hull boats within minutes of splashdown. These aren't ordinary divers, they're Navy Special Operations personnel, trained for open ocean work in heavy seas. They approach the capsule carefully, checking for hazards before making contact. The capsule could be venting toxic gases from the propulsion system, hypergolic fuel residue that's both corrosive and poisonous. There could be unexploded ordnance, pyrotechnic devices that didn't fire during the parachute sequence. The heat shield could still be hot, hundreds of degrees, dangerous to touch. The swimmers verify it's safe, then attach the flotation collar, a large inflatable ring that wraps around the capsule's base. The collar stabilizes the capsule, prevents it from rolling, and provides a work platform for opening the hatch. Once the collar is secure, the swimmers signal that it's safe to approach. A helicopter hovers overhead, ready to evacuate crew if needed, while the recovery boats move in closer. Inside the capsule, the crew is going through post-landing procedures, shutting down systems, securing equipment, preparing to exit. They're in communication with the recovery team via radio, reporting their status, confirming they're all okay. The hatch opening takes several minutes. There are mechanical latches to release, pressure to equalize, seals to break. The swimmers work methodically, following procedures, making sure everything is done correctly. When the hatch finally opens, fresh air floods into the capsule. The crew gets their first breath of Earth's atmosphere in 10 days. Salt air and sea spray and wind. After 10 days of recycled air that tastes metallic and sterile, the smell of the ocean is overwhelming. The exit process varies based on crew condition. If everyone is mobile and the seas are relatively calm, the crew can climb out onto the flotation collar, step into the rigid hull boat, and ride to the Portland. If anyone is injured, weakened, or if the seas are too rough for boat transfer, the helicopter lowers a rescue basket. The crew member climbs or is placed into the basket, the helicopter lifts them out, and flies them directly to the ship's deck. Medical personnel are waiting in either case, ready to assess the crew's condition. The initial medical check is quick but thorough. Vital signs, alertness, mobility, any obvious injuries. The crew is then escorted to a medical facility on the ship for more detailed examination. Blood pressure, heart rate, blood draws to check for biomarkers, neurological assessment to check for any effects from radiation exposure or microgravity. The medical team is looking for anything unexpected, any anomaly that might indicate a problem. Most of the effects of 10 days in space are predictable and temporary. Muscle weakness, bone density changes, cardiovascular deconditioning, fluid shift. All of these will resolve over days to weeks with proper rehabilitation. But there could be surprises, radiation effects that don't show up immediately, psychological stress that manifests later, physiological responses that the models didn't predict. The data collection doesn't stop at splashdown. It continues for months as the crew readapts to Earth gravity. Meanwhile, Orion itself is being recovered. If the capsule is intact and floating stably, it can be towed into the Portland's well deck. The well deck floods, the capsule floats in, the well deck drains, and suddenly Orion is inside the ship, out of the elements. Recovery crews secure it, begin safing procedures, removing hazardous materials, draining propellant, making the capsule safe for transport. Engineers swarm over it, photographing every detail, documenting the heat shield condition, checking for damage, collecting samples. The heat shield gets particular attention. Pieces of the charred avcoat are carefully removed and bagged for laboratory analysis. Engineers map the char pattern, measure the recession depth, look for cracks and spalling. All of this data feeds into the analysis that will determine whether Artemis III can fly. The capsule will be transported back to Kennedy Space Center, where more detailed inspection and analysis will take place over months. But the first assessment happens here, on the Portland, within hours of splashdown. Initial reports go back to mission control, to NASA leadership, to the engineers who designed the heat shield. Did it work? Did the modified trajectory reduce spalling? Are there any new concerns? Any unexpected behaviors? Anything that suggests the fix wasn't sufficient? Those questions will be answered over time, but the first data points come from the recovery ship, from the engineers examining the capsule while it's still wet with seawater. The crew has been in microgravity for 10 days, not long enough for severe deconditioning, but long enough that standing upright in full Earth gravity feels heavy, awkward, like wearing a lead suit. Their vestibular systems are recalibrating. Their legs, unused to bearing weight, feel uncertain. Koch, who readapted after 328 days in space, knows this feeling. For Hansen, it's another first. the feeling of gravity after floating. The weight of your own body pressing down on joints and muscles that haven't had to support anything for 10 days. The sensation that the ground is tilting, even though you know intellectually it's level. The medical team helps them walk, supports them as they take those first uncertain steps. Within hours, they'll start to feel more stable. Within days, they'll be walking normally. Within weeks, most of the physical effects will have resolved. But some things won't resolve. The memory of what they saw, the experience of being farther from home than almost anyone has ever been, the perspective that comes from seeing Earth rise over the moon. And at that moment, standing on the deck of a Navy ship, blinking in the Pacific sun, legs wobbling, ears ringing with the sound of helicopters and cheering crew members, the mission is over. Artemis II is complete. The first crewed voyage to the moon in more than half a century has ended. The spacecraft worked. The crew is alive. And the data from every sensor, every biomedical reading, every thermal measurement from that heat shield begins flowing to the teams who will decide whether Artemis III can fly. When they step out of that capsule, they'll hold records. Christina Koch will be the first woman to have traveled beyond low Earth orbit. Victor Glover will be the first black astronaut to have flown on a lunar mission. Jeremy Hansen will be the first Canadian to have traveled beyond low Earth orbit, and he'll have done it on his very first spaceflight. Reed Wiseman will have commanded the most consequential NASA test flight in decades. And all four of them will have survived the fastest crewed re-entry in history. Those records matter because representation in space exploration has been painfully slow. Valentina Tereshkova flew in 1963, the first woman in space. But it took another 20 years before another woman, Svetlana Savitskaya, followed her. American women had to wait until 1983 when Sally Ride flew on the shuttle. And despite decades of women flying to low Earth orbit, no woman has traveled beyond it until Koch. That's not because women aren't capable, it's because the opportunities didn't exist. NASA's astronaut selection has been gender-blind in recent classes, selecting candidates purely on qualifications. But the missions beyond low Earth orbit, the deep space missions, ended in 1972. For over 50 years, no humans of any gender have flown beyond the magnetosphere. Koch's presence on Artemis II corrects that historical gap. Young girls watching this mission will see that deep space exploration isn't just for men, isn't just for a specific type of person. It's for anyone with the skills, the determination, and the courage to reach for it. Victor Glover's achievement carries similar weight. Guion Bluford broke the barrier for black astronauts in 1983, proving that space was for everyone, regardless of race. But like Koch, Glover is extending that achievement into deep space. He's not just the first black astronaut on a lunar mission. He's demonstrating that the future of exploration includes everyone. The symbolism matters, but so does the substance. Glover isn't on this mission as a token. He's there because he's an exceptional pilot, engineer, and astronaut. His skills and experience make him qualified for this role, independent of any historical significance. The historical significance is real, but it's built on a foundation of competence and capability. And Hansen, representing Canada, represents the international dimension of modern space exploration. The Artemis Program isn't purely American. It includes partners from multiple nations. Canada contributed the Canadarm systems to the International Space Station, robotics that have been essential to assembly and maintenance. The European Space Agency is providing the Orion service module, the propulsion and power system that makes these missions possible. Japan is contributing logistics and potentially habitation modules for the Lunar Gateway Station. This international cooperation is fundamentally different from Apollo, which was a purely American program with minimal international involvement. Artemis reflects a world where space exploration is collaborative, where nations pool resources and expertise toward common goals. Hansen's presence symbolizes that collaboration, reminding us that returning to the Moon is a human achievement, not just a national one. But the mission will also have answered a question that no amount of testing and modeling could answer. Does this spacecraft work with humans inside it? And does the heat shield hold when lives are on the line? The answer to that question determines whether Artemis II, the first landing attempt, can proceed. It determines whether 4 more astronauts can ride Orion to lunar orbit, transfer to Starship, descend to the surface, and become the first humans to walk on the Moon since Gene Cernan in December of 1972. Everything depends on what happened during that re-entry. And that brings us to the uncomfortable questions. The questions about what happens next. The questions about whether this program survives long enough to actually land. Because Artemis II succeeds or fails not just based on whether the heat shield holds, but based on whether the program can maintain political support long enough to achieve its goals. Let me lay out the situation as clearly as I can. The Space Launch System costs $4.1 billion per flight and flies roughly once per year. At that cadence and that cost, the program is on a political ticking clock. Every year that passes is another $4 billion Congress has to authorize, appropriate, and defend. And the competitive landscape has changed in ways that make Artemis both more urgent and more vulnerable. SpaceX's Starship program is advancing faster than many expected. As of early 2026, Starship has completed multiple orbital test flights, demonstrated in-space engine relights, and successfully caught the Super Heavy booster with the launch tower's mechanical arms. That last achievement, catching a skyscraper-sized rocket booster out of the air, was something most aerospace engineers thought was years away. SpaceX did it on their 5th attempt. The orbital refueling demonstrations are ongoing, with incremental progress on each flight. They've transferred small amounts of propellant between tanks in orbit, validating the basic concept. Scaling that up to the full depot and tanker architecture that Artemis depends on is still unproven. But SpaceX's track record suggests they'll figure it out, probably faster than traditional timelines would predict. And here's what changes if they succeed. A fully operational, rapidly reusable Starship system could launch cargo and crew to the Moon for a fraction of what the Space Launch System costs. Not just cheaper, but orders of magnitude cheaper. Early cost estimates suggest a mature Starship operation might cost $50 to $100 million per launch. Compare that to $4.1 billion for the Space Launch System. That's a factor of 40 to 80 difference. At that cost differential, the entire architecture changes. Instead of launching one mission per year and making every flight a high-stakes bet, you could launch monthly. Instead of sending 2 astronauts to the surface for a week, you could send larger crews for longer stays. Instead of carefully rationing each mission's science objectives because you might not get another chance for years, you could iterate rapidly, learning and improving with each flight. The political question is whether Congress will continue funding the space launch system if a clearly superior alternative exists. The workforce argument, 30,000 jobs across 44 states, is powerful, but it's not unlimited. If Starship is flying dozens of missions per year to the moon, while the space launch system flies once, the optics become untenable. Constituents start asking why we're spending billions on outdated technology. Journalists start writing stories about government waste. And eventually, some administration decides that redirecting that $4 billion per year to other priorities is politically advantageous. That's the scenario that keeps NASA leadership awake at night. Not technical failure, but political obsolescence. China adds another dimension to this. The Chinese space program doesn't face the same political constraints as NASA. They don't have to justify budgets to elected representatives every year. They don't have to navigate competing constituencies or defend cost overruns to the media. They set long-term goals and execute them methodically. The Long March 9 rocket, China's answer to the space launch system, is in development with a target of first flight in the early 2030s. But China isn't waiting for that. They're building their lunar architecture incrementally using existing rockets. The plan involves launching the lander and crew vehicles separately, rendezvousing in lunar orbit, similar to Artemis but using proven hardware. Their timeline points to a crewed landing around 2029 or 2030. If they hit that target, and if Artemis II hasn't flown by then, the narrative shifts dramatically. The United States would go from being the only nation to have landed humans on the moon to being the nation that gave up the lead and lost it to China. That narrative has political consequences that go beyond space exploration. It feeds into larger questions about American technological leadership, about whether we can still do hard things, about whether the political system is too dysfunctional to sustain long-term projects. Artemis isn't just about the moon. It's about proving that democratic systems can compete with authoritarian systems in areas requiring sustained focus and investment. We've been here before. In 2004, NASA announced the Constellation program to return to the moon by 2020. Constellation included a new crew capsule, Orion, a new heavy-lift rocket, Ares V, and a new lunar lander, Altair. By 2010, the program had spent $9 billion. A review panel concluded it was over budget and behind schedule. President Obama cancelled it. $9 billion. Gone. The lander, gone. The rocket, gone. Only Orion survived. Could Artemis follow the same path? The uncomfortable answer is yes. Not because the engineering is bad, the space launch system works, Orion works, but because the cost structure may be unsustainable. The cancellation of the space launch system upgrades in February of 2026 was telling. Those were the more powerful versions that would have been needed for later missions, particularly those involving larger payloads and more complex orbital operations. The official explanation was risk reduction. Standardize on what works, stop developing what isn't ready. But the subtext was hard to miss. The program can't afford to keep developing a rocket that costs this much per flight. The same month, congressional spending included $4.1 billion earmarked for rockets for Artemis IV and Artemis V, with mandated minimum spending through 2029. Congress is funding Artemis for now. But funding a program $4 billion at a time, one flight at a time, isn't commitment. It's life support. It keeps the patient alive for the next cycle without addressing the underlying condition. The most important thing Artemis II can do for the program's survival isn't setting records or taking photographs. It's demonstrating that the incremental approach works, that each flight builds on the last, that risk decreases, that the architecture converges toward a landing. If the data from this mission is clean, if the heat shield performs within limits, if life support and navigation and communication systems all check out, then Artemis III becomes politically defensible. If there are anomalies, even minor ones, the critics will have ammunition. That's the pressure these 4 astronauts carry, whether they think about it or not. They're not just testing a spacecraft. They're testing whether the political system that built it can sustain it long enough to deliver on its promise. But here's what I keep coming back to. Space exploration has always been vulnerable to political calculations. After Apollo 11 landed, public support for the Moon program dropped. People saw it as mission accomplished. No need to go back. 3 more Apollo missions were cancelled. Apollos 18, 19, and 20. Hardware already built, crews already assigned. The cancellation wasn't because of technical failure, it was because the political will evaporated once we'd beaten the Soviets. The same thing could happen to Artemis. If Artemis II flies successfully, returns safely, validates the architecture, there's still no guarantee Artemis III gets funded. Budget priorities change, political winds shift, and long-term programs are always vulnerable. What makes this different is the stakes. Not just American pride or scientific discovery, but the question of what kind of civilization we want to be. Are we a civilization that explores, that reaches beyond our boundaries, that invests in projects that won't pay off for decades? Or are we a civilization that optimizes for quarterly returns, that can't think past the next election cycle, that sacrifices long-term vision for short-term gain? Apollo answered that question in the 1960s. We were a civilization that could do hard things, that could mobilize resources and talent and will toward an impossible goal. We went to the moon not because it was easy, but because it was hard, because the challenge served to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Kennedy said that, and he meant it, and the nation believed him. Artemis is asking that question again. Can we still do hard things? Not with wartime urgency and unlimited budgets, but with peacetime budgets and political constraints and all the messy complexity of a democracy trying to function while deeply divided. The answer isn't clear yet. Artemis II is flying. That's real. That's an accomplishment that shouldn't be minimized. But whether it leads to Artemis III, whether the program survives long enough to land astronauts, whether we actually return to the moon, or whether this becomes another abandoned program, another might have been, depends on choices we haven't made yet. It depends on whether the next administration supports the program or defunds it. It depends on whether Congress sees value in lunar exploration or decides the money is better spent elsewhere. It depends on whether the public cares enough to demand that we finish what we started. So where does that leave us? 4 humans are out there right now in a spacecraft smaller than most people's living rooms, moving through a void that's indifferent to everything we've built and everything we argue about. They're out there because of a congressional act signed in 2010, because of a risk calculus shaped by the memory of Challenger and Columbia, because of a procurement system that optimizes for political survival, and because of a dream that predates all those things. The dream of going back. And tomorrow, when Orion swings around the far side of the moon, and the last radio signal fades to static, something will happen that makes all the politics irrelevant for 45 minutes. The crew will see the far side. They'll photograph the South Pole Aitken Basin. They'll float in the silence and know in a way no amount of simulation can replicate what it means to be the farthest thing from home that exists. And then, as the trajectory carries them around the curve, something will appear at the edge of the window. Earth, rising over an alien horizon. 54 years between Earthrises. The same view through different eyes, from a different spacecraft, in a different world. The moon doesn't care why we came. It only knows that we're here. And right now, 4 people are proving we haven't stopped reaching. Even when the reaching is harder and slower and more political than it should be. Even when the rocket was designed by Congress and the timeline was set by budget analysts and the whole program might be cancelled before it ever puts boots on the surface. They're out there. And the view from the far side is the same one that changed everything in 1968. We chose safety over speed this time, politics over engineering, caution over ambition. We built a rocket by committee and funded it by the year. And we sent 4 people to circle the moon instead of landing on it, because the lander isn't ready and the architecture couldn't carry it anyway. Whether that was the right choice depends on what comes next. On whether Artemis II flies, on whether we actually land, on whether this program survives long enough to deliver on the promise that put those 4 astronauts on that trajectory. But here's the thing about Earthrise. It doesn't care about budgets, doesn't care about authorization acts or procurement systems or launch cadence. It happens because a spacecraft swings around the moon, and the geometry of 3 celestial bodies produces a moment of accidental beauty that reminds every human who sees it that we live on a very small world in a very large universe. That image has been seen 24 times by human eyes. Tomorrow, it will be seen for the 25th, 26th, 27th, and 28th time. And no matter what happens to the program that put them there, those 4 humans will carry that image with them for the rest of their lives. They'll know what Earth looks like from the moon. They'll know what silence sounds like when you're farther from home than any living human. They'll know that we went back, even if we only went part way, even if we're still arguing about whether we can afford to go the rest of the way. Earth is tiny. Our individual lives are brief. But the cumulative effect of billions of humans making choices, developing technology, creating knowledge, and passing it to the next generation has brought us to this moment. 4 people farther from home than anyone in half a century, looking at the moon with their own eyes, proving that wonder still drives us forward, even when everything else tries to hold us back. Thank you for joining me on this journey tonight. If this exploration meant something to you, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Your support helps me continue making these deep explorations of space and our place in it. And remember, right now, tonight, 4 humans are circling the moon. The moon doesn't care about congressional acts or budget cycles or political compromises. It only knows that we came back. And that matters more than all the complications that brought us here.